Antrich und Ehre, was ich dir noch angesäche, so bist du ihr aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschehen? Dass ein Magd ein Kind gebar, ihre über aller Engel Schar. Was das nicht ein Wunder gab. Hier ließ sich reine taufen, dass der Mensch.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. I am here tonight with Dan Baltic. Dan Baltic is an author who has recently started a podcast called New Right. That's WRITE, along with the writer Matt Pegas, dedicated to platforming dissident literature. You can find their podcast on Patreon, Twitter, and YouTube. I've included all of their links below. So Dan is joining me today to discuss New Right, their mission. I'm really curious to get some of their origin story, as well as just discuss the state of publishing and the state of dissident literature. So Dan, welcome and thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, LT, for that very generous introduction. And yeah, thank you for inviting us on. It's great to be able to speak more about our project here. And so yeah, Matt Pegas and I started a pod called New Right, and our goal is to provide a platform for dissident literature. And so obviously your listeners are familiar with the dissident right, but what is dissident literature? That's the immediate kind of.
Sure, that would be my first question on my my Google Doc here.
Well, what are we really talking about?
Yeah.
So what we're talking about here is, and this is what led us to start the pod, is Matt and I, we both wrote novels, and we met on Justin. Let me start from the beginning. We met on Justin Murphy's forum, Indie Thinkers. We found out that we were both novelists.
And that's how I should mention. That's how we all got connected.
Oh yes, yeah, exactly. That's how we all met on Justin Murphy's forum. And so Matt and I started talking. Matt's novel has been published. Matt's novel Dragon Day has been published by Terror House Press. Mine, Nutcranker, is still looking for a publisher, but in both cases, we found that it's very difficult to get fiction published that is not politically correct. I mean, it's not even the right word for it anymore. That is not kind of doesn't toe the woke party line when it comes to the various taboos that you're not allowed to really talk about. And so, maybe for other demographics, that wouldn't be as much of an issue. If maybe we were both white women, that wouldn't be as much of a concern. But as straight white men writing fiction, there are just certain things that are taboo and cannot really be discussed honestly in the traditional literary publishing world. And so Matt and I, found that we couldn't really find traditional publishers, and I still am looking for a publisher for Nutcranker, and we found also that in trying to find out, are there books, novels being published outside of the traditional publishing environment, outside of, essentially, I think the term of art, Cathedral. The Cathedral is
Mhm.
something that your listeners will be familiar with.
Sure.
So yeah, so is there fiction being published outside of the Cathedral? And the answer is yes. And so Matt and I realized this, and we located, and we both found we liked some of these writers who were self-published or published through Terror House or Expat Press, and we realized that though there is a kind of nascent publishing industry outside of the Cathedral, there isn't the infrastructure to discuss it. So Matt, when he wrote his novel Dragon Day, he wanted to find pods to go on to talk about it, and there were none. He went on the pod of Terror House, which is great. Terror House is great, but it's the publisher. So he did go on pods, but not explicitly literary or culture oriented pods. And so we realized there's a real niche for this. There's a real need for this, and that's what started New Right. And we both do lean somewhat to the right to varying degrees. Would be I imagine considered reactionary by some, but New Right is really kind of a wink and a nod to, like, it's not, we're not a doctrinaire neo-reaction publisher or something. What we are simply trying to do is provide a platform for people who cannot be published by the Cathedral for whatever reason.
Right.
And so some of those people will be right wing, some will be left wing, but I think what we all share in common is that our writing is in some respects honest in a way that is no longer possible in the traditional publishing environment. And those are the voices that we're trying to platform, and those are the ideas we're trying to discuss.
Awesome. And is that I am semi familiar with Terror House, and I probably should have looked into them a bit more. I did listen to the majority of the podcast you did with the individual from Terror House, but is that sort of their mission statement as well, as Terror House trying to platform kind of dissident, outside writers outside of the Overton window? Are they? I think of them sort of like as Imperium Press for fiction writers. I don't know if that's a fair comparison, or
I would say more in line with what I described as the mission statement. I don't want to put words in Terror House Press's mouth, or Matt Forney, who is the publisher, or in his mouth, but they are, explicitly, I think, in their mission statement, they're looking to publish outsider fiction.
Sure.
And I don't think, though, they certainly have platformed and published a number of dissident right writers. They're not even explicitly political.
Right.
Terror House is looking to publish fiction that can't be published in the traditional publishing environment. And it sounds like we're the podcast arm of Terror House. I swear that's not actually.
Yeah, no, it's just how many players are in the game at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
And I wouldn't want, truly, I wouldn't want I wouldn't want a publishing house interested in fiction to have some sort of explicitly political motive. Dan, do you think you could maybe mention, I know I think you're up to your fourth or fifth episode at this point. You've covered Mike Ma as one writer, but could you maybe just mention a few contemporary writers who our listeners might be aware of, whose fiction you feel would broadly be categorized as falling under the New Right umbrella?
Absolutely. And so Mike Ma would obviously be one, but I think kind of, and it would not be that controversial to say that the prototypical New Right fiction writer is Delicious Tacos.
Yeah, and he's under Terror House's label. I think
he's self-published, but he's a friend of Terror House. Matt Lawrence, who we did our third episode of the podcast with. He draws the covers.
Right. That's why I thought he was published by Terror House. I remember that point you made in the podcast.
Yeah. And so Tacos is huge. I mean, he sells a ton of books. He outsells traditional literary fiction published by the actual publishing industry, and his writing is quite good. So like he is the kind of progenitor of this movement that we're trying to platform. And so so Tacos, Mike Ma, Zero HP Lovecraft.
Yeah.
We actually have not, between Matt and myself, we have not actually read yet, so I'm not going to speak too much about him. But we understand his writing is very good, and of course is outside of the mainstream. So
I think he would be comfortable with being categorized under the New Right. And I know he's friends with Delicious Tacos. He certainly hangs out in that milieu. I know he blurbed Matt's book. And he's very active Twitter personality. So I'll speak on behalf of Zero HP that I think he'd be fine to be considered New Right, and I'm sure at some point you guys will get him onto your cast. Yeah, so that's kind of where my mind was headed and where I was situating you guys. I'm curious, Dan, if you or Matt, if you guys did any, if you shopped around in sort of the standard publishing houses, or you were looking for an agent, I'm just wondering if you have any horror stories of the rejections or I guess any responses that you got. I mean, were people, if you were trying to go a more sort of standard traditional route with your books, were people very forthcoming with you just by saying this is all forbidden kind of tone and subject matter nowadays?
Yeah. So I made the rounds with my my query letter, and agents almost uniformly would just say like we're not going to publish this, and even small presses as well would say they're not. And so I should say that Nutcracker, my novel, is kind of a modern day Confederacy of Dunces, with the main character being kind of a very overeducated incel type, sort of not that I do not think there are very valuable insights from neo-reaction, but like he's very steeped in wanting to collapse democracy. And stuff like that.
I'd buy a copy. It sounds great to me already, but
yeah. So that's kind of So it's like a satire of these things. So that obviously doesn't have a lot of traction in the current publishing environment. And an interesting story here is I reached out to a former professor of mine of creative writing, and he has a connection to an MFA program, and he told me candidly that his straight white male MFA students who write dark fiction can't get published and can't get agents. And
wow.
That's like, this is a real, top MFA program. I have no doubt that the students there, the straight white males writing dark, humorous stories, they're probably quite talented. The stories are quite good. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they'd be, you'd hear of them. You'd be reading about them.
Yeah.
But no dice today.
That's crazy. I mean, the one kind of straight white male dark comedy writer that still seems to be kind of in the limelight a little bit that immediately comes to mind for me is Sam Lipsyte. Like Sam Lipsyte has not been, canceled.
Oh, no.
And his stuff is, I think you could put that right on the shelf next to Delicious Tacos at some point. I think it's absolutely fantastically, politically incorrect much of the time. But I guess he kind of came on the scene a little earlier.
That's just what I was going to say, that some people are grandfathered in.
Right.
So like Sam Lipsyte, I love his fiction,
Me too.
and
Yeah.
he's great. Um, he would not get published today. I don't think he is published today, but only because he's already Sam Lipsyte. A young Sam Lipsyte would not find an agent today. I don't think. Another great example of that would be Welbeck. Welbeck, famously is like, a has written about social atomization, sexual atomization. He had
Yes.
a novel called Submission, which imagined what would happen if France became a sort of caliphate. And
Yeah. Yeah.
obviously, that's pretty politically incorrect. But he continues to. He's very popular, sells a lot of books, a lot of novels, but crucially, well, he's French. Number one, I think France oddly has a more liberal cultural environment than we do. We liberal in the sense that you're allowed to say stuff,
Right.
not in the sense that you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And but a Welbeck in America today, like an American Welbeck would be like Delicious Tacos. And Delicious Tacos, sure as shit isn't getting an agent,
Yeah.
at least right now. So, yeah.
That's interesting. I was trying to think. I mean, I was, before we scheduled this, I was trying to think to myself, Dan, like who would never get an agent today? Just sort of like thinking about writers from history, and like Welbeck was on my list. That came immediately to mind. And my big Welbeck book was Elementary Particles. Came out when I was in college, and I read that, and that was like maybe like an early red pilling wasn't really a thing yet, but that movie, that was one of the most important books of my life. It just like, it kind of blew me away. But yeah, I don't think there's no way, shape or form Welbeck's getting published. And even people, I was thinking like another writer that I loved when I was in my 20s and when I was in college was Philip Roth. I don't think there's any way, shape or form that Roth would ever get published. Or Henry Miller. Like that's another one that came immediately to mind. It's funny because a lot of those, but I mean, Roth, Miller, certainly. I think Welbeck is always kind of an oddball. I don't think people know what to do with him, but people like Roth and Miller are still like, Library of America auteurs that are sort of, maybe not Miller so much, but definitely Roth was nationally celebrated. And absolutely. I think that like men and women both read his books, despite the fact that it's an obviously just, I mean, such a male voice and a male perspective in all of his literature. But yeah, I don't think he'd get an agent today. No way.
Yeah. I think you have like.
I don't know if Hemingway would, quite honestly.
No, I'm sure he wouldn't. I think there's a real division between pre-civil rights movement and post-civil rights movement authors in terms of one, like pre-civil rights movement authors will, almost uniformly not have what is generally considered today to be the correct positions on race and gender and all of those things. And so, yeah, you could not possibly be someone with like even the opinions of Fitzgerald, which were, the popular opinions of the time. You could not, have those opinions and expect to get published anywhere. You might, depending on your country, wind up in, prosecuted or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not an expert on European law, but so you have pre-civil rights movement literature, and then you have people like Roth, people who wrote in essentially contemporary literature, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and so people like Roth, Bret Easton Ellis, Jay McInerney, Paul Auster, Norman Mailer. I'll even include John Kennedy Toole, even though he wrote at an earlier period. He was only published in like the late 70s or early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And these writers I would characterize as people generally who have the right the right opinions, according to the cathedral, the right opinions on questions of race and sex and gender and what have you. Largely the right opinion, like maybe not 100%, but they don't know how to express it in the right way. So yeah, if you're Philip Roth, you're not gonna get a publishing contract today if you're just starting out, because the way you talk about women, or even maybe the way you talk about other races, is going to strike people as being impolite. Not necessarily being like completely verboten, but it'll be like you're not being sensitive enough to the lived realities.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, so what fiction now can be published today? It's the type of fiction that is sensitive to those realities. And so what does that mean, to be sensitive to all of these things? It means you really it depends on who you are. But if you are a straight white male, it means there's not a lot you can really write about, honestly, unless you write in a very sensitive manner that is frankly not very honest, and does not really inspire engagement from people, from readers. So yeah, I mean that's what's happening today.
Has your MFA professor was he candid in saying what publishers are looking for, or if they sort of have a description of a prototypical novel that they are after? I'm curious if the term, I forget if I heard this from you and Matt or not, but just the term like workshop fiction mean anything to you? Do you feel like there's I don't know if you're a veteran of a lot of writers' workshops or MFA programs, but I'm curious if there is sort of a prototypical standard kind of prose that's coming out of MFA programs right now, or if it's still somewhat of a mixed bag.
I mean, I think what you see in MFA programs today is, again, that dynamic where there's various things that you can no longer really talk about or say, and as a result, the stories are going well. I mean, number one, literary MFA programs are mostly designed to produce literary fiction, and so it's driven by its audience partly. Who reads literary fiction? It's NPR listeners. And NPR listeners, they don't want to hear anything that's not woke. So while there are other genres in publishing where you could get away with more, in literary fiction, you right now, because the cultural elite, the liberal cultural elite, are very under the spell of for want of a better word, wokeism, whatever you want to call it. The fiction that they read will necessarily be have to dovetail with those political ideals. So the workshop fiction, the new literary fiction, you see in a situation where if there's more leeway, more latitude, if you are in some way a marginalized voice, because you could talk about your experience honestly, in a way that doesn't offend people, because you can't offend people if you are a minority of some form or sort talking about your experience. So like a good example of this, and this isn't literary fiction at all, this isn't fiction, but it struck me as instructive. My friend was at a comedy show recently, and there were two comedians on stage, not at the same time, of course. And there was a white comedian and an African American comedian, and the white comedian was just much less funny. I couldn't, but the reason why, well, and my friend, he's not even very based. He's a more or less a normie. but
Mhm.
he put it together in his head. He said, "Oh yeah, the white guy can't talk about anything edgy, but the
Yeah,
black guys can go in the edgy place, and that's where the humor is."
sure.
So it's
I mean, that's
essentially
what's
like
going on right now with Dave Chappelle. His latest
exactly.
special, I think they're trying to get it yanked off of Netflix, but he's sort of an uncancelable figure, like maybe the only uncancelable sort of Achilles,
Yeah.
immortal man that's been dipped into the river Styx and can't be slain. But we'll
Yeah,
see.
no, I mean, if a white guy did that special, he'd be in prison right now.
Yeah, yeah. Or
I
dead.
mean, like,
Yeah.
potentially in reality, but he'd be certainly in social prison.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious. I mean, it's been so long, honestly, that I've read any kind of like contemporary fiction that isn't like Welbeck's latest or something that I have to like, send a check in the mail for a copy of a book to read. I have no idea what it's like. I just, I'm curious if a lot of kind of contemporary MFA fiction or the NPR, literati fiction, as you put it, if it's as sort of canned as a lot of TV that I see nowadays. Like like is every couple that's in the story like a like mixed race couple? Is it that
Yeah.
this this stuff that's just always reads as so kind of canned and mandated?
I think there is a Netflixization that is going across cultures and mediums. And yeah, I think that literature, literary fiction, is kind of Netflixized right
Mhm.
now. So yeah, you have like all of them are stories that promote narratives that are, also, I mean, and I was talking about this with Matt the other day, my co-host Matt Pegas. Um, the reason why these, woke literary fiction and woke art in general is bad is not just because it is, there are things it can't say. It's because of the stuff it does say, and the stuff it does say is promoting a political ideology that is false. So like if you're promulgating an idea that is like just demonstrably like, this is not true, this is not how people, act in reality, it's going to look stupid, it's going to sound, really weird.
Yes.
So like as compared to there are examples of, certainly of various like political agitprop from the 80s and 70s that actually holds up pretty well. And I would say like I really enjoyed, for instance, Boys in the Hood,
Hmm.
and that that certainly is like I don't think the director would even be offended if you called it agitprop, but
Yeah.
but it didn't have this woke narrative of like the only the major threat to black men are the cops who are just
Right.
running around gunning them down.
Yeah.
Like that's not. It's not true that is reality.
Yeah.
So if you have a movie that depicts that, it's just going to seem ridiculous because like it's just not the reality of.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
certainly not an African American man and can't speak to that, but I have a feeling that if there is street violence, if that's a concern, I would imagine the cops are like very like this minor concern on the the level of like
Yeah.
all the various ways you could be taken out.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Um, I'm curious if there's so Dan, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent here, but I did have some notes. I'm interested in asking you this question, but it'll be maybe like a long-winded question. I think well, I guess for starters, another figure that not a fiction writer, but I think his name just looms in front of me and it comes up as somebody who would again be very comfortable in this space is Bronze Age pervert.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, he writes kind of Nietzschean. I don't know, even, I guess it's nonfiction. I don't know how I would categorize it. He writes like, so sprake there Zarathustra for the, the postmodern age. But I guess one thing I noticed, and I've read Bronze Age Pervert and Zero HP. I read most of Mike Ma before I knew we were going to talk, and I've noticed that a lot of this is what's interesting to me. So a lot of these writers, and Delicious Tacos would count as this as well. I'm surprised to realize that a lot of these, you did an episode on this as well. I think you called it you titled the episode the Manosphere to Literature Pipeline. That's and right. All of these guys that I just mentioned, they seem like they're sort of, I've observed through like their Twitter, not through their fiction or their prose directly, but like via Twitter, that they're all very familiar with pickup artistry and like what was, at least at one point called the PUA community. And so, I'm dating myself a little bit here, but, I guess for start, I'm very interested to realize, and this is a recent revelation to me. This, I read Bronze Age Pervert last year, and that's when I realized that there's a lot of like sophisticated writing that has emerged out of the manosphere, so to speak. And
absolutely,
in the mid to late 2000s, that's when I sort of encountered like the PUA community. That was like, I guess that was like first wave pickup artistry. I don't know if there's a term for it. That was like the era of Neil Strauss had come out with The Game, which was his his memoir of having met Mystery, who we should talk about that book maybe a little bit at some point.
Oh yeah.
But definitely. I at the time, like I had just kind of ended my first major relationship, and I read The Game and I found it fascinating. I'm not claiming it's, high literature or anything like that, but I read that. I read The Mystery Method, and at the time I found it all very like mesmerizing, and I'll admit that I tried putting a lot of it into practice in my dating life at the time. Like I'm not claiming that in any way, shape, or form I was ever a PUA or anything like that, but it certainly helped reverse my polarity when it came to women in my dating life, since I was anything but a natural when it came to like courting women, or anything when it came to the opposite sex. But it sort of seems like I maybe missed the bandwagon, and perhaps this is because at the time I wasn't much of an internet person as of yet, but it seems like either after that, I'm not sure what the timeline is, but there was like a lot of really interesting, I don't know if it's second wave Game or when the pickup community became the manosphere precisely. Or it might have just been a fact that I missed this because, in 2011, I finally, met my wife, the woman that I would eventually marry. But it seems like part of that community has just become more and more interesting, and having and talking about broader issues than just how to flirt with women after I stopped paying attention to it. And I was struck in particular by something that you and Matt had said in one of your earlier podcast episodes. I wrote it down, as a matter of fact. You guys it was that Manosphere episode, and one of you had said that before the Trump era, sex was more interesting than politics. And after Trump, politics became more interesting than sex. Like this strange polarity. And I don't know when that's when the kind of the writing and the theorizing around male and female dynamics became kind of, the atom got cracked and it became more expansive. But around the Trump era, around 2016 is when it's when I first encountered Moldbug, and I kind of began to move to the right slowly. Like right as Trump was elected is when I basically got, quote unquote, red pilled. I know I got, red.
Me too, more or less.
Yeah. Red pilled is a little probably confusing as a term because it was both, used in the the manosphere pickup artist community to be when you learn these these tricks about the human social order, and red pilling is when you read Moldbug and you become aware about some human political realities as well. But before that, I was just like a default lib, but I honestly did not spend a lot of time thinking about politics. And I spent these years when I was reading Moldbug also getting married and starting a family. But and from Moldbug, as my sort of like, this was my how I spent my time. Instead of reading pickup books, I was reading old like old unqualified reservation blog posts, and that led to a lot of the kind of.
Since you already had your wife, that was probably time better spent.
Yes, absolutely. But he led me down a lot of other writers that are more in the sort of trad cath sphere. A lot of the people that Moldbug talks about are old school, sort of pre-Protestant Reformation political thinkers. And I wound up, following a lot of like within the dissident right space, this channel often, although I'm myself am secular, like I kind of hang out with the trad cath set. And I'll get to my point very soon, I promise. I'm sorry. Preliminary information, but that's sort of the side that I wound up on as I sort of became to identify with the dissident right. The books I read, the personalities that I was paying attention to online were just trad caths for the most part, or at least Christians. And I think in part that just kind of occurred naturally. Another aspect of that is that they just sort of have more of a blueprint, and to speak to more to my life as a married man and a father. But it wasn't until I encountered Bronze Age Pervert and Zero HP Lovecraft that I as I got done with all my old trad cath writings, and I picked up Bap because he was what everybody was talking about at the time. And I was honestly, I was like, holy shit, these are the same guys that were kind of like within that early 2000s pickup world. They've both kind of alluded to it. And, I've heard both of them sort of mention game directly. And it's obviously that they've spent time kind of reading those books and all the books that kind of came out after, Mystery Method and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I found it fascinating that on the one side, I thought that was all stuff that I'd left behind, and this was sort of my new identity. This was like my 20s was about learning about game, and my 30s is going to be about dissident right-wing politics. And then I sort of showed up at the meeting and was like, oh my God, you're the same crew of guys. Or at least like half the room were other people in the in the pickup forums. And I found that fascinating, and it honestly just blindsided me, because I did not think that would be, that's not what I anticipated. I thought that I had sort of I'd gotten into dissident right stuff because I'd matured past, needing to needing to meet women and learn these tricks of the trade. This will all be thoroughly off brand for me, by the way, because most of my listeners are traditional Catholics, and they'll view this as my confession. But I guess what's interesting to me is that you would think that these sort of worlds are polar opposites. That you have traditional Catholic, but I'd say, but for one thing, I mean both sides are almost just universally men, whether you're sort of in the manosphere Bronze Age pervert camp of the dissident right, or whether you're in more of a sort of traditionalist Catholic sphere of the dissident right. And it's just interesting that they sort of find themselves aligned politically. At least they have the same enemies. They read the same books. They read one another. And I guess, I mean, I have a number of questions that I want to pitch to you, but one of them is just sort of, what do you make of the fact, I don't know if you've observed this yourself, Dan, that sort of like traditional Christians or trad caths and manosphere guys kind of find themselves in the same trench. And, I've been trying to scratch my head and ask myself questions like, are they really fundamentally that different, or is there something core to either personality that seems like, I don't know, both really seem to favor like rules-based systems in one form or another. I think both would be really kind of skeptical about egalitarian relationships, between the sexes. And it also seems to me, just, one other point is that the borders between these groups seem somewhat porous. I think there was like the one famous pickup artist, I think his name was Roosh, who was a big PUA personality, who eventually kind of converted to Christianity.
He's an interesting story.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah. I don't know if is that anything that you've kind of picked up on, that we all seem to be in the in a strange, it just makes for strange bedfellows, I guess.
Yeah. So I think the question is, or rather the issue is, why is it that you have a bunch of pickup artist guys in the dissident right? And how did they get there? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think I'd even put it a bit more broadly. I think what and I don't want to, I feel really cheap describing Bronze Age Pervert or ZHP or any of these guys as pickup guys. They've just sort of alluded to the fact that they're pretty fluent in the lingo with that. I think what it speaks to is it's this dichotomy and this dialectic on the dissident right that I've sort of referred to before as it's the clearest manifestation of a very fundamental dialectic and division going on the dissident right, which is Nietzsche versus Christ. There's sort of this civil war
absolutely
that has been going on for a long time, and I think that the manosphere, Bronze Age Pervert is probably the biggest personality in that sect, are the Nietzscheans. They're not very interested in reinstating any kind of like ancient regime, unless it's like the Roman Empire or like the Greeks. And then you have Christ, the people that are come at it from a more Catholic perspective, and yeah. So I guess that's how I would frame it. It's the Nietzsche versus Christ dilemma on the right at the moment.
Well, I would say that they are both united, and this is why and how you see the progression of writers from the manosphere into the dissident right. Because as the culture changed, well, let's back up. Why were they in the manosphere manosphere before the manosphere, the red pill dating game, whatever? They were there because they took the red pill. And what was the red pill? The red pill is that there are natural biological and thus psychological differences between men and women. And those differences, can be exploited to get you laid. And so that is what, they were writing about and doing. And then, keep in mind, they're doing this in, the kind of fallout of the end of the sexual revolution, and we're all living in the kind of an age of sexual and personal atomization. And so the attitude of the men in the manosphere was kind of, it sucks, but, get your shit together and make the best of it. And you can reap the reap the rewards of, this dysfunctional, atmosphere. And I think what gradually happened was, as the culture became crazier and crazier in terms of its, impositions on the ability of men to live, reasonably good lives, and also these guys getting older and, just wanting families and stuff like that as well. They took that red pill understanding of sex and brought it into politics, because politics, is even in like 2008, 2009, it wasn't that, you know, it wasn't a matter of, am I going to lose my job for making a joke? It wasn't quite there yet. Or like, or better yet, am I going to lose my job for complimenting my female coworker? And so what really began to happen was the culture shifted in a way that you know, really makes life pretty untenable for normal male existence as we've understood it throughout history. So I think that is kind of what brought the manosphere writers into politics, and they, you know, found the Tradcaths there already because, you know, they both are reacting. They're both, you know, in some ways reactionaries to the same, you know, thing that's happening, which is you know, you have the progressive agenda, which is, you know, radically anti-family, anti-man, anti, you know, freedom of thought. So yeah, you find them kind of together, and I think that you probably do find a number of manosphere writers who probably, and like I think here an example would Jack Murphy would be a good example, who probably when he was a you know, more of a manosphere guy, probably had a real like libertarian, like, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think this is his kind of trajectory. Had a more libertarian, let live, and, you know, live and let live. And but then as he became more political, he realized that a culture has to have values. And if you want to be able to live in a decent society, you need to actually have not an absence of values where anyone could do whatever they want, and, you know, but a values that are promulgated by the actual, you know, if not the state, by, you know, a mores and consensus. And so yeah, I think that men who were writing in the manosphere, they grew up, and they, you know, as they were growing up, they got hit by this, you know, comet that is the, you know, the Great Awakening. God, I hate that term, but, you know, I don't know what you're going to call it. And yeah, so that led them to the dissident right. And I think they and the Tradcaths are united by a sense of that, you know, in order for communities to thrive, you need trust. You need you know, a certain, you know, acknowledgement of, you know, the difference between men and women. You need to have you know, certain, you know, social mores, and about sex, about criminal justice, about a number of other things. And yeah, I mean, I think the manosphere writers got there by means of the red pill, and people like the Tradcaths had, you know, had always, you know, they were born with the red pill. So
that's an interesting.
That would be my understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, and in hindsight, I first felt gobsmacked when I was like, oh, there are PUAs in the dissident right, and then you know, a few pulses later, I was like, I felt like an idiot because I realized, well, of course, because I mean, most of Moldbug's political observations are just, this is the same kind of intuitions and observations about, you know, how power really works on a societal scale as opposed to on a relational scale, you know, between men and women. I mean, there's just so much obvious like valence and symmetry to those things in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
You know, like, you know, what power really is, you know, what what entropy is, you know, what's there, you know, you could do kind of a side-by-side comparison. I think another, that was a really interesting and satisfying explanation, Dan. I think another something that I honestly struggle with as I just kind of continually sort of ping pong between both sides of the dissident right community is, I think one of the bit that, while there's obviously a lot to agree with one another on and kind of lock arms with, and I think often sometimes maybe it is just fundamentally an age gap. I in some ways I think they have very kind of contrary and perhaps irreconcilable notions of manhood in some way. I think that again, I mentioned earlier, part of the reason that I spend most of my time with the trad cats is just there's more scaffolding there once you have a family. And I'll admit, Dan, that I wanted to get through Mike Maugh's Harassment Architecture before we talked, and I put it down halfway through. And no offense to Mike Maugh, I thought it was a decent book, but I put it down for the same reasons as why I don't hang out with divorced men. Which is like a lot of the book involves, it's sort of like his style kind of reminded me a little bit of like Chuck Palahniuk or Bret Easton Ellis, but it's not, I wouldn't reduce it to just sort of like sexual memoirs, but there was a bit of like, it reminded me a bit of Tucker Max and kind of the fratire scene that came out in the 2000s as well. And he wrote about all of that honestly and well, but I just don't like kind of putting myself in the position of kind of spectating or glorifying that lifestyle just for the sake of my own well-being. And there is this kind of dichotomy, like on the one hand, I think, there's this kind of mutual respect and admiration for one another between the traditionalists and the Nietzscheans, as I'll call them. And when I say that, I just really mean sort of like, I guess, if I want to define the manosphere or the Nietzschean camp, it's sort of the secular pro-sex dissidents as opposed to the theological, more conservative.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean.
But I feel like the trad side of the equation either does not address, just kind of doesn't address it at all, or does a relatively bad job of addressing questions of sex and issues of sex, or kind of the deteriorating sexual relations between men and women. And I think that a lot of the Nietzscheans kind of return the favor when it comes to questions of family and family formation. And I mean, one thing I plan on getting Zero HP on the program at some point, because I've heard him. I know he values his privacy, and I hope and I believe I'm not violating it, because I've heard him make mention of it on other podcasts. I believe that he is a parent, and he might be sort of the missing link between this. But I find it difficult to take a lot of the kind of I guess the lessons learned both in the like old manosphere community and the kind of messaging that still gets delivered in a lot of that into my life stands now. I mean, try feeling alpha when you have 2 child seats in the back of your car.
Yeah. I mean,
try nagging your wife when she's breastfeeding and making sure that it comes off as kind of like cute and flirtatious. And it's just a very different world. And part of the reason why I'm asking you about this, Dan, is I'm curious if so all of the writers that we've talked about, I think everything I've kind of seen coming out of Terror House, Delicious Tacos, Bronze Age Pervert, Mike Maugh, they're all very, I don't know if you would disagree, but I would categorize them all as the Nietzschean manosphere side of the dissident right. And so I'm curious if you've seen any writers on the dissident right that are attempting fiction come out of a more traditional perspective, or has most of the kind of creative artistic output, which wouldn't wouldn't surprise me because I think that the energy on that side of things is a lot more kind of, Dionysian and dynamic and filled with eros. But have you noticed any dissident right wingers that have a bit more of a kind of traditionalist perspective on things?
So I have, and this comes with the caveat that it is obviously an emerging, field and space. So one of the problems is there's a paucity of writing out there, paucity of fiction out there, and so I think as it evolves, you will see more genres, you will see more in the way of different, and even within writing about sex, like Harassment Architecture is Mike Ma's debut novel. It's very like supercharged. He's a young guy. He's like, I think he's 26.
Yeah,
so
I would have guessed.
yeah. But like, if for instance, if you were to read some of Delicious Tacos' stuff, I mean, a lot of it is very, he's a man in his 40s, and yes, he does write about sex, but he also does write about love and loss, and like he does cover the whole side of Eros, not only the copulating side of it, and so like yeah, there's Tacos. There's Ma, and but beyond that, beyond people who focus on male sexuality, you do have, for instance, there's a science fiction writer.
I was going to ask if there's like what other genres have you been noticing, kind of dissident stuff popping up in, if at all?
So yeah, like Zero HP, as you know, is a horrorist. We do plan to read his fiction. We have not yet.
I can tell you, he does write about sex, but not in any way, shape, or form like Delicious Tacos. It's more like a nightmare, Lars von Trier film vision of sex.
Yeah, so there's Travis Corcoran, who does sort of, my understanding is, and I have not read his stuff either, a kind of right-wing science fiction. So maybe something like Robert Heinlein. And interestingly, and this is on one of Bronze Age Pervert's latest podcasts, Caribbean Rhythms, he interviewed a novelist who I had never heard of, who published a novel in 2012 called, I believe, Breakfast for the Dirt Cult. And he's a veteran who wrote about his experience in Afghanistan. And I mean, some of it I think involves sex, but that's more like not in Afghanistan. And yeah, it's a memoir of his time at war, and it's a memoir that could not really be probably I assume could not be published by the traditional publishing industry today. And I need to dig into that one as well. But yeah, there's for instance also there's decent cultural criticism coming out of this dissident space as well. So there's someone who we're going to have on the pod pretty soon on New Right called Bad Billy Pratt, and he writes, he writes about about sex and dating, but also meditations on pop culture, and kind of he has an essay about how it's similar actually to your video, The War on the Third Way and Boys, and similar to how culture stopped at Nirvana, and that after the 90s, the culture kind of disappeared, and so he talks about stuff like that, and it's. I think
the name of his book, Welcome to Hell, or
yes, Welcome to Hell.
Yeah. It's got one of those delicious tacos style art.
That's right, by Matt Lawrence,
Yeah.
who was also on the pod. And so, I mean, I think this is all to say that it's a burgeoning field, a burgeoning, and people are, just kind of honing their craft and, just getting out there. And, we're hoping to help them do that. And it's like, it is very difficult to write in a vacuum. Like I more or less wrote this novel in a vacuum because I couldn't really workshop it with anyone, because like I tried at a workshop and like a woman there said, like, well, you obviously write very well, but why would you write this?
Yeah. I can empathize with that. I mean, I did a lot of fiction writing and fiction workshops when I was in college at a very liberal institution. And my God, I just prayed at the altar of Philip Roth. So I was coming into my fiction workshops. It was me and 90% female classes and me trying to do my best Philip Roth impressions. So not a lot of people walked to the cafeteria with me after those.
I bet.
Yeah.
I bet.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And I think it's fair to say I mostly observe kind of more cultural criticism coming out of a lot of the more traditionalist or religious members of the dissident right. I have not seen a lot of people kind of try their hands at fiction. But I wouldn't be surprised if, like I said, I think I would not be surprised if I heard from Zero H.P. Lovecraft that he began writing horror when he started his family. Not that family life is horrific, but just that there's sort of this pivot that happens in life where you've got to take that kind of, not to get too Freudian, but that libidinal energy and put it into a new craft.
Put the energy.
Or like, for that matter, like Heartiste, I know he kind of seems like he went off the rails into some sort of unsavory flavors of nationalism. When I was
that would be one way to put it.
When I was hearing you guys talk about it, I was like, I wonder if he just got married. He like had so much pent up libido that he was like, I have to do something with this. I think I'm going to become like a radical extremist.
It's going to be really hard for him to find a wife with his current political agenda.
I'm sure. I guess speaking of sort of different writers and different genres, another question I had for you, Dan, was, so you meant, and I'm pleased to hear that there's people working in memoir, there's people working in science fiction, but I'm curious if you found it to be the case that some genres are more right-wing than others, or are there any genres that are kind of fundamentally left-wing versus right-wing? I know it's kind of like a pretty tired cliche, and it's one I've talked about at length on my channel, that horror is in some ways this just sort of fundamentally right-wing genre. But do you think that there are kind of spaces that are going to be more resistant to dissident fiction, or do you think that you can kind of see these voices crop up anywhere?
Yeah, well, I mean, the issue is essentially that literary fiction well, I'll back up a little bit. Any product is defined by its audience. So who are you pitching it to, basically? And so literary fiction is being pitched to the NPR set. Mm-hmm. The people who are firmly within the cathedral. They maybe even help run the cathedral. So they are, absolutely not going to be open to dissident lit. And this is why you see dissident lit is mostly literary fiction. It's mostly, and that's one of the reasons why it's men writing about sex, because it's literary fiction. It's, men writing about their lives, it's not like it doesn't, it's not a detective story. It's not a thriller. But that brings me to the next point. For other genres, the other genres have audiences that skew more conservative. So thrillers, airport fiction, stuff like, Tom Clancy novels, James Patterson novels, they will be a little more conservative. They won't be as woke, or, I'm not a big consumer of them, but my understanding is that they, they are not as, they don't talk about pronouns too much when they're storming, the embassy or whatever.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So that, and as well as sci-fi, honestly enough, I think in the notes you mentioned that sci-fi seems very progressive. I'm not a huge connoisseur of sci-fi, but I think there's certainly more wiggle room in any of the genres than there is in literary fiction. So like sci-fi, like the guy I mentioned, who's a dissident, arguably a dissident right sci-fi writer, Travis Corcoran, he's won awards. I think he's won like Hugo Awards. And like because there are people who will read him in the community of science fiction readers, whereas the literary fiction community is not, there's no one there. None of these wine moms want to read about like, incel, horror stories, or satires. They're just like, I got to call the FBI.
Yeah.
And so, we're not going to get much, penetration there. But
I think you're right. I mean, you made me think of like hard-boiled detective, like real gritty noir, like James Ellroy, L.A. Confidential. That kind of stuff is all like, none of that's PC. I mean, that might be kind of a fading genre at this point.
Yeah.
But there's a fair amount of like gritty crime drama that is. I think it has a bit of it's so genre. It's such a thick genre, and the detective, the persona is like, has to be such an asshole that you can kind of get away with it being kind of more of a dissident art form a lot of the time.
Yeah. And crucially, it's about the plot typically. So you don't really have to like, does this guy have opinions that are, unwoke? This detective, like, he probably doesn't even get into that very much. It's about like, who killed who, how are you going to catch him?
Mm-hmm.
And like, as long as you don't, in the novel, talk about the perps in a way that is inflammatory, you should be fine. And and the same goes for like thrillers, as long as you don't talk about use any slurs when describing Middle Eastern terrorists, you're probably going to be okay.
Yeah.
And but whereas like it's much trickier to you're writing a novel about a guy who is going to break up with his girlfriend. I mean, it's a lot harder to be like, very PC when you honestly describe the thinking process, and like maybe the thinking process is, I realized that I could just do better, and I don't want to sell myself short. And, that I think that is, maybe something that is not okay anymore. I don't know.
Yeah. What about, I'm just briefly, I'm curious, anything on your radar in like the fantasy genre?
Not really, but like, I mean, I think there's certainly an argument that like, Tolkien is,
I mean, he's the ultimate trad. I put a full video on him in the future. I think it, but in some ways it's because
C.S. Lewis.
Yes. Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
I mean, like for recent, I'm not like, I thought Game of Thrones was pretty good. I don't think like, I mean, I read it in like 2015. I wasn't really attuned at like many to the culture wars at that point, but I recalled it having like a pretty right wing take, I think, on like power and masculinity.
Yeah. It's complicated. Yeah. I think George R.R. Martin is a really strange case because I think you're right. In some ways, it's very gritty and dark and Machiavellian. In some ways, I think Martin wrote it as kind of a critique of Tolkien. Like he obviously loves and admires
Oh
Tolkien,
yeah.
but it's sort of this, you know, he can't really accept the degree of sort of romanticism that you have in Tolkien. So instead of, you know, Aragorn being the Christ-like Return of the King, he just sort of shows you the, like, you know, the grit, like, you know, the terrible reality of, you know, medieval medieval politics that Tolkien tends to kind of romanticize. But in other respects, I think part of why he can't really end the series, or he'll never manage to finish the series, is because he is, at the end of the day, like a liberal, and there's no real resolution that he can kind of bring to the story
Yeah.
without capitulating to the kind of, I guess, religious tropes and metaphors that he sought out to critique in Tolkien. You know, like he kind of set up Jon Snow and Daenerys as the, you know, the promised, you know, return of the king or return of the queen, but to fulfill that promise would be returning into kind of like a symbolic order and a kind of pagan or Christian worldview that would undermine his like liberal critique of. And so that's why my money's on we're never seeing the end of the series.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also he's like pretty close to the end, so like I don't know if we're getting more books out of this you know, like Methuselah, dude.
Yeah, he might go the full Wheel of Time in that regard. I mean, the other great, I guess, sort of right-wing banner within like the sci-fi fantasy world is Dune. I mean, Dune is sort of.
Oh yeah, I'm watching the show right now. I embarrassingly have not read the book, but I like it. I like the first half hour that I've seen.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, it's. I'll send you some.
It's right wing. I understand.
Yeah, it is I mean, especially amongst like, I guess, the dissident trad cats. Anybody who was slightly nerdy in high school, there's probably about 100. Well, it is the neo-reactionary Bible for like nerdy dissidents at this point. And Dan, we don't have to go on too much longer, but I do have I guess one question I had is, have you found that, I know you mentioned that like Delicious Tacos gets a lot of fan mail from women, but have you found it to be the case that that women are any kind of sizable minority in being interested in these kind of books? I think it's kind of an interesting and new phenomenon that women and men seem drawn to entirely different literature from one another nowadays. Again, I mentioned earlier, I think, you know, when Phil in the 70s or the 60s, if Philip Roth came out with a book, like you read it regardless of whether you're a man or a woman. Like men read Joan Didion, or there was not this, I guess, just divide in just this clear divide in what men and women are reading. At least there wasn't in like this preceding decades. I mean, to an extent, that's always true, especially if it comes to things like pulp. You know, women prefer, you know, bodice rippers and romance novels, and men are typically the ones reading the, you know, true crime or whatever. But have you seen any kind of interest from women in these
Not
writers?
enough.
Not enough,
I must say. It's, you know, it's interesting. We joke, Matt and I, that we're doing this to get laid, and it's you know, it's hilarious because, like, you know, it's very hard to even like get anyone to read your work, and you know, far from like being something that would like ever like help you you know, get attention from women. The, you know, vast majority of women, if they, you know, even knew that you were publishing like dissident literature, would probably not want to consider you as a partner. So it's like actively, and we discussed this, Matt and myself, that it's so strange to be embroiled in this endeavor that is like, you know, will actively repel women because the drive, of course, in life is to, you know, find you know, a mate and you know, and amass money and resources for your potential children or your actual children. And what we are doing here with this pod potentially compromises our jobs and also compromises, I mean, certainly, I don't, this is like a third date conversation, if that, maybe longer.
Yeah, when is that? When do you politely slide it into the, like, getting to know you, like, courtship? Yeah, it's true.
So this is to say that women are, there are very few who are reading these types of novels, and I think the reason is because the space outside of the cathedral has been, kind of stigmatized as a space where people who hold ideas that are evil exist. And, women very instinctively, they don't want to be in the place where, people aren't able to get jobs and, are stigmatized. Like, women more so than men are drawn to security and to, what will bring, they're drawn to high status men who will, give them a proper life of some sort. And, but for men are sometimes drawn to different things. And like Matt and I were talking, like, there's no real, evolutionary utility maxing reason why we're doing this. And we realize the only reason is we both care about writing and we care about the truth. And that was it. And it's fun.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, we do it because it's fun.
Yeah, no, it's interesting too. I mean, the dissident right in general, I guess one problem that I think it has is, as I described, there's this sort of Nietzsche versus Christ tension paradigm that's just always kind of the yin and yang of the the cultural space. But I think there is kind of like I mean, and I don't mean to segue too far away from literature, Dan, so stop me if I go too far afield, but I think there is kind of a woman problem on the right, in that there's just I mean, I think everything you said about your podcast and just writing about this, the type of fiction that you're trying to produce and that you're interested in, can be said about just kind of the dissident right wing political space as well. I'm going to try and get Alex Kashuta on the podcast or on my show soon, because and I feel bad because I don't want to I don't want to pigeonhole her and put her in this position, but as sort of like the queen of dissident right Twitter and also the only chick in the space, how did you find us? Why are you sticking around? How do we get more more women? How does it become, I guess, sorry if I'm rambling, but
no,
I'm just curious how this is all going to, if I looked at 10, 20 years down the road, there's this fissure between, what men and women are reading. And granted, at the moment, men in the dissident right space are certainly a minority, and women certainly have their pick of the litter when it comes to, blue-pilled men with, decent status. But I do think that, in general, the dissident right tends to attract interesting, provocative men that women find interesting for many reasons, smart, successful, interesting men, certainly men that are willing to take risks. But if we're in a cultural space which already is one in which women cannot admit to any level of attraction to men that are attracted to this type of fiction or these type of ideas, what does that look like 10, 20 years from now? What's the next generation going to be like? Are we just going to have this chasm between men and women? And I think eventually there's going to be some point where, I don't know, men on the DR look a little bit more high status than the blue
Well,
check
I
mark
think
guys.
so. Yeah, I think that, this is a movement that is in its infancy. And like right now, yeah, the pioneers are the ones who, typically get dysentery and die. And like, hopefully that's not us. Hopefully we don't, get dysentery. But, then, you claim a homestead, you develop it. And yeah, and then people come when it's like actually, a place that people want to be. And it has like working, facilities and
You're saying we need toilets before we
yes.
need plumbing before we can get women into the compound, basically.
Women like a clean bathroom.
Dan, I mentioned I was not a natural when it came to learning any of like I was also like a total rube when I first started reading Moldbug. I was just like, honey, listen to this, like read this. Let me tell you about how the American Revolution was really this like, secret psyop. And, it took me at this point, my wife, whom I love dearly and has like 20 IQ points on me. And I think it's just something about what, like we've been talking about, the differences between men and women. Like I have attempted an explanation of the cathedral 50 times. And I've given up. And it's not because my wife is not a brilliant woman, but it's just, It doesn't interest her. It's not provocative. It's not something she finds titillating. So there's, I've sort of given up on inviting women to the political conversation at the same time as I'm kind of uncomfortable with the sausage party we have going on here, both on the trad side and on the the Nietzsche side of things.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that the current political environment, it, is uniquely harmful to men. So yeah, we're going to notice it more. We're going to, like the same way women notice, certain cultural trends that, impact them negatively. Like, yeah, generally the cultural trends.
I can't sit and watch television with my wife anymore. It's like because all I see is like I'll a commercial will come on, and I'll just be like, and I wind up seeming like I'm Hunter Thompson on drugs or something, but I'll just leap out of my chair and be like, do you see the subliminal messaging in this ad? Like they're selling adult underpants. Why does the couple have to be like mixed race in their 80s? Like that means that couple had to marry one another in 1950. Like, what are the odds of a mixed race couple happening in America in 1950? And she'll be like, why do you care? And I'll be, and but that's how it is with, 95% of every show on any channel now is she's just
absolutely
accepted the fact that we can't watch shows together.
I mean, the stuff like Netflix, just like whatever they produce is guaranteed to be something that not only is like, doesn't say anything that's taboo, but proactively promotes, woke narratives that are nonsense and crazy. So like you have stuff like, I remember there was some, I don't even know what show this is for, but it was a trailer about a group of African American outlaws who commandeer a train, which is being run by Union soldiers, and they execute all of the Union soldiers. And it's just very stylized violence, and it just is very clear, racialized violence as well. And you see this, and there are a number of reactions. One is like, it's a little gross. I don't want to see something that's so, but then the deeper reaction is, to me, why is it there? Why are they doing it? And if it's something that's historically accurate, okay, sure, that makes sense. Like if it's a scene of Indians scalping and killing, settlers, yeah, okay, even if it's super graphic, it happened, it's true. Mm-hmm. This is something that never fucking happened. This is and the only reason it's there is because they want to show, white Union soldiers being killed. and and so for that reason, it's difficult to watch these shows because it's the active promulgation of narratives that are not rooted in reality and are instead designed to propagate ideology.
Yeah. It's always the I again, these are the conversations that I've decided to, no longer get into with my wife, because they just don't seem to bother her, and I wind up being on the defensive. And my what one that I've noticed that is just so kind of uncanny, and it's a pricklier one, but literally every single advertisement for anything, any product on any show is mixed race couples, mixed race families. And my wife is always like, but why do you care? And I turn into a Seinfeld episode. I'm like, of course there's nothing wrong with it. Of course there's nothing wrong with it. But why? Isn't it weird that like 99% of every couple, like in the, other life hypothetical Sims world that we're, that we are viewing is so completely remiss with reality. And and there's it also just create like there's this inauthenticity to it too.
That's it.
The stories would be fine if I'm trying to think of
if they were real. Like if they were authentic. But so like Indians, Native Americans scalping settlers, that it's difficult to watch. It's whatever, but it's actually real. It's actually it happened. And similarly, like if you see a story about an interracial couple that's like actually just like a story that is like but when you see it's there as propaganda, it's like we know why you're doing this, we know why, it's
and it always just it jumps you out of the narrative. It completely just if you were in any kind of flow state of viewing something, it's always so jarring to me. And then it's doubly jarring that other people that I'm watching with don't bother. Like the most recent example for this for me was even more kind of weird, and it's getting even more bizarre than just like every love story, every love interest has to be a mixed race couple. There's a show that's pretty popular right now with Steve Martin and Martin Short called Only Murders in the Building. And
I just assumed that was terrible.
I mean, I'm watching out of one eye with my wife. But Martin Short plays this just flamboyantly gay, like Broadway musical director, and like the whole time you're just like, obviously this character is gay. He wears like bright purple jackets, and he just has produced half a dozen Broadway plays, and he lives on the Upper West Side. Very, fey, effeminate guy. And then like on episode 4, you find out that he's like divorced, and he was married to a black woman, and his son is this very like macho black veterinarian who helps him take care of his dog. And it's like, it's even more uncanny than just like, oh, well, the love interest has to be black, or the love interest has to be, the opposite race, because it's like the whole premise of this character up until this point is that this is kind of like a single New York City like theater director. But at some point, somebody in the process of producing this said, we don't have enough black characters in this. Give him a son and make him heterosexual. So now it's even just like the snake eating its own tail, where like a gay character can't even be gay because it hasn't given them the proper quota of skin tone to tell the story. And it's just, I'm curious, and I'm always curious if that kind of stuff is happening if I was reading contemporary literary fiction, if I was bothering to give it a taste.
Like a good example, I think, of that dynamic, how how today is different from the before the woke period, is I don't know what, I just wanted to read reviews of Boys Don't Cry because I had a hunch And and so I looked it up on Rotten Tomatoes, and almost all the newspapers don't carry the reviews anymore. I'm like, okay, I know why. And so, interestingly enough, the New Yorker, David Denby, who was the film critic for the New Yorker at the time, I guess 1999 or 2000 something. I forget exactly when it came out, but yeah, so he describes it, as the way someone in that era would describe the movie, as a movie about a sad and confused girl who dresses up as a boy and gets killed. And that is, and okay, gets killed isn't fair. She's murdered by, people who, were disturbed by her. And, it's, obviously don't condone that at all. But, the the way he talked about it is just so at odds with the discourse today over what a trans person.
They didn't describe it as a hate crime or
well, I mean, crucially, he described it as a girl who dresses up as a boy and has mental problems, whereas today that would be oh, you canceled forever. You can't say that. You can't that is a boy. That is, and I don't want to get you canceled from YouTube here, so I'm trying to go a little light. Yeah. But it just struck me that the times have changed so much.
Yeah.
And so what we see today, the David Denby of 2005, who was just is there a place in the New York City literary establishment that's more rarefied cathedral air than the film editor of the New Yorker?
Yeah,
it's hard to find. And so that guy would be canceled today. And and probably the woke stuff that that we have to watch on Netflix, he'd think this is ridiculous. This is this is terrible.
Yes. I could go. I've thought about doing if I had more bandwidth for my show, I would do the top 10 weirdest woke casting every week, because I find at least a dozen a week of things where I'm just nope, that was not supposed to be a Puerto Rican girl. That was supposed to be a 7 foot tall white guy, or it's so uncanny. Dan, I've kept you for a long time. I did have one last question, and I'm happy to chat or if there are any other things you wanted to talk about. But one thing I wanted to touch on was I'm curious if you have thoughts about fiction for younger kids, and I guess especially younger boys. I hear all the time now that boys aren't interested. I mean, kids in general are much less interested in reading, but particularly boys are not at all interested in reading. And I'm of the opinion that's because the books that they get handed in grade school are just so milquetoast and lame. And if you just handed these kids some Robert E. Howard or some Treasure Island or some Lovecraft, but something that gives them a sense of adventure and how these books can actually be exciting, and you can have kind of strong, interesting male characters. Are there books that you think that either matter to you or that you would recommend to dads to get in the hands of their sons?
Absolutely. And this was out of the questions we discussed, this was my favorite. Okay. I had a lot of fun thinking about this. And I have to say, as I'm looking over my list, I guess I was thinking more of the son who is 16 and not the Treasure Island reading age. There's a lot of great stuff for, younger boys. But this, what I put together is intended for someone who's 16, maybe very precocious 14. I mean, certainly these books are still, good as very good, the best books, for you to read throughout your life. And I will say as a preface that I wish that I had been exposed to these books earlier, but I remember in high school, and not to say she was a bad teacher, she wasn't a bad teacher, but she had all of her stuff was on feminist literature. So I read Kate Chopin and The Doll's House, and all of this feminist literature, The Awakening, and this is like I went to an all boys school. we, we we like we're just like all looking at each other like, oh, what the fuck, gotta read more of this shit. And so here's the real list. Here's what I think.
Yeah, please.
I think a truly Catholic education would be to read all of these writers. And so starting with the ancients, Homer, so the Iliad, the Odyssey, Virgil, the Aeneid, the plays of Aeschylus, Aristophanes, and I mean, obviously I could go on and on with the ancients. The history of the Peloponnesian War, for sure, by Thucydides. That's a biggie. So moving on from the ancients, the medieval, I mean, honestly, there's not as much just because Dark Ages produced, but Chaucer, Beowulf, the sagas. Moving on to the Renaissance. Yeah, the Renaissance, Don Quixote, arguably the first novel, and a satire as well. So that's really in my wheelhouse. I love Don Quixote. Shakespeare, of course, he's Shakespeare. Dante, Divine Comedy, and every man should read The Prince. Not fiction, but very instructive.
That's a book that every father should slip into their son's like coat pocket as they leave for college or something.
For sure, for sure. And possibly my favorite, the Augustines, Pope, Henry Fielding, Tom Jones, Daniel Defoe, Jonathan Swift, just a lot of like great satirical writing, and that was during a period that had a lot of more and I maybe the Tradcaths won't be as on board, but a bawdier period in English history.
Oh, I bet they won't mind.
Moving on to the Romantics, Lord Byron, Coleridge, Wordsworth, those great poets. Keats, of course, the Victorians, Dickens, Melville, like George Eliot. There's women can be based too.
Oh yeah, I'm a big huge Jane Austen devotee.
Yeah, Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice. Yeah. I think for sure every boy should. My parents actually gave me a framed copy of the poem "If" by Rudyard Kipling, and that's that is a great one. Moving on to the modern period, which we're all probably a lot more familiar with. Obviously, the Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Edith Wharton, another based lady, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, Ezra Pound. I'm probably forgetting a ton, but that's what came to mind. Moving on from that to the Beats, Kerouac, Burroughs, Ginsberg. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of the Beats, but it's an important era in American history.
Sure, yeah.
And Kerouac's it's a fun read, if not great literature. So that's just my take. Other people will disagree, of course. And for contemporary, as you mentioned, Roth, but also Updike, Mailer, frankly, and this is super contemporary, but Sam Lipsyte. Love Sam Lipsyte. Richard Price, he does really hard-boiled kind of New York, Brooklyn crime stories. And this is a guy I had wanted to mention before, but had not had the opportunity. He is super contemporary. His first novel or second novel, but it's the big one that came out in 2016. All That Man Is. His name is David. It's hard to pronounce. It's a Hungarian last name, but David Szalay, I think, or Szalay. David Szalay.
How do you spell
And
it?
so that's Szalay.
I would have never
And I
known
think
that.
that's, yeah. I think I've heard it pronounced once before, and I think it was Saloy. And he is a contemporary, and then this is my pitch for him here. He's one of the few actual literary fiction writers lauded by the Times. I think he maybe even won the Man Booker Prize or one of those prizes. And it's really based his writing. It's really it's about it's his novel is called All That Man Is. It's a novel that has like literally is composed of like 12 short stories that all focus upon a protagonist that is a man at a different stage of his life, going from like teenager to 100. And
Oh wow.
it's just, yeah, it has like really good insights, really like, doesn't pull any punches. And yeah, he's probably my favorite contemporary writer.
Oh, I'll definitely
Gary,
check it out. That sounds great. Yeah.
yeah, no, I'll send you a link to his stuff after. Also, I should get in there Gary Steingart. Some of his politics I don't really like, but nor does probably your listeners. But he does write good fiction, and it's actually surprisingly based as well. So Phil Clay, he wrote Redeployment about the Iraq War, and he's a vet. His stuff is pretty good. And yeah, I mean, other than that,
It's not more than made up for your feminist high school lit class, Dan.
Yeah. I had to re-educate myself.
Sure. Yeah, most of us do in one way or another. Very cool. Well, Dan, should we wrap it up? I guess again, I'm sorry Matt couldn't be here, but I'm gonna go out and order a copy of Dragon Day because it sounded
awesome.
Interesting. I'd love to have you guys on again. Definitely, I'll have you on again once you find a home for your book.
Oh yeah, for sure. We'd love to be back. Yeah, I will send it to you. I'd love your thoughts on it. And yeah, looking forward to doing this again.
Awesome.
It was fun.
So everybody, please listen to their back catalog of episodes. I've got all of their links in the bottom of the show notes here, and The New Right. So Dan Baltic, thank you again, my friend.
Thank you, LT. Appreciate it.
Take care.